Okay, so I'm Sabbir Rashid, and thank you for the introduction, Deborah. So I'm a PhD candidate working with Deborah McGinnis, and also on my committee is Jim Hemler, Mohammed Zaki, and Amar Das. And today I'll be giving a talk on employing ensemble reasoning to support clinical decision making. So this talk is broken up into four main parts, as well as an intro and a conclusion. So part one relates to the knowledge representation we created to support our system. And part two relates to the actual design of the system and what went into evaluating it. Part three involves a clinical relevance survey that we conducted with actual clinicians. And we got their insights on what they felt about our recommendations and the rationale for those recommendations. And then finally, part four, I'll be very brief, but I'll slightly discuss some of the theory. It's presented in detail in the thesis, but I'll just talk about some of the high-level ideas without actually going through any of the proofs. And then we'll finally conclude with some future work and takeaways. So pretty much this research stems from a question of how can we construct a clinical decision support system that incorporates multiple forms of reasoning in a manner similar to how physicians do. So that leads us to the problem description of the design, implementation, and analysis of a clinical decision support system that can perform ensemble reasoning. So ensemble reasoning is a term we defined to be a type of hybrid reasoning that deals with the integration of multiple forms of reasoning. And we defined this term because hybrid reasoning has been kind of an umbrella term used to describe the integration of many things, including types of reasoning, but also like the inclusion of the integration of A-box and T-box reasoning, which is kind of given nowadays. So just to distinguish ourselves, saying that we're thinking about multiple types of reasoning like abstraction, deduction, induction, abduction, and we're integrating and studying the interaction of those different types of reasoning. So as mentioned, the motivation for this work relates to aiding physicians with decision-making problems. And we apply this work in the realm of diabetes, which is a prevalent problem in the US and across the world. So the clinical model that we base our approach off of is called the select and test model. It's the ST model for short. Pretty much this model can be used to do clinical decision-making tasks, including differential diagnosis, therapy planning, plan critiquing. The important takeaway here is that there's multiple forms of reasoning involved within the ST model. So you have like abstraction, abduction, prediction, validation. And also important to note is it's a cycle that loops around where you may infer something or predict something through deduction, which then might lead to another abductive query, or which might lead to inductive validation. So without further ado, this brings us to the first part of the talk, which we discuss a semantic knowledge representation approach using concise ontologies to support multimodal reasoning. So this is based on a research paper that was recently accepted into ESWIC, which I'll be presenting in Greece at the end of May. And it constitutes chapter 4 of the thesis. So the research contribution related to this part relates to our development of this concise ontology, which was FAIR compliant in order to support multimodal reasoning. And we demonstrate how this ontology can be used to support and we evaluate.
Sorry. Okay. Sorry, I was going to try to monitor who was remote, but that didn't work.
Okay, so pretty much first research contribution is our FAIR compliant concise ontology, which supports multimodal reasoning. So the motivation for creating this ontology is that typically when domain ontologies are created, such as an existing diabetes ontology, the DMTO, diabetes mellitus treatment ontology, the approach usually involves encoding as much knowledge as possible to have a comprehensive encoding of the domain. Anything that could be used for the treatment of diabetes, for example, would be included. But the problem with such an approach is that the bigger the ontology, the more time consuming it is to reason over the ontology. This becomes even more apparent when we're doing non-monotonic reasoning like abduction, where we may be adding knowledge to the graph and also taking away knowledge to the graph if something gets negated through the addition of new knowledge. So instead of designing a comprehensive, complex, very large ontology, what we did was we focused on conciseness. And we did this in order to support our use case involving type 2 diabetes. So since we needed a structured vocabulary to support our use case, what we first did was we looked at standards in the domain of diabetes, and the most popular clinical practice guideline for diabetes is the ADA clinical practice guidelines. And we focused specifically on chapter 9 of the ADA guidelines related to anti-glycemic treatments. So treatments for high blood sugar. And in particular, from chapter 9, we focused on factors and therapies. We also wanted to use real patient data or hypothetical patients that resembled real patients, right? And we found that the NET-CE, there's a diabetes-related course on there that has examples of diabetes patients. So we thought those would be a great set of patients to test our approach with. So the patient characteristics and symptoms that we included in our ontology was based on those included in those case studies. So we also imported some concepts from external ontologies. So we used the minimum information to reference an external ontology term principles, Marriott, where when you're including a term from another ontology, you just include just the direct superclass of that ontology, and then maybe if you're using any of the restrictions of that term, you include that term. So instead of importing the whole ontology, we just imported specific terms that we were using and only their direct superclass. And then you can also include labels and comments if you want, since annotation properties don't necessarily contribute too much to time complexity. So real quick, when I say we used pharmacotherapy factors and medications from the ADA guideline, it's a little hard to see, but in the top, this is a table directly from the ADA guidelines. In the top, you have columns like efficacy, hypoglycemia, weight change, ASCVD, heart failure, cost, renal effects. So those are the pharmacotherapy factors we included in our ontology. And on the left here, you have different categories of anti-hyperglycemic treatments, such as biguanides, SGLT2s, GLP-1s, DPP-4s, TZDs, and sulfonylureas. So that was the basis of what therapies we included in our ontology. So this is kind of like a high-level depiction of what the diabetes ontology looks like, diabetes pharmacology ontology, maybe going down 3 or 4 hops from the top tier. So pretty much the root concept is therapy planning component, which is broken up into diagnostic factor, pharmacotherapy factor, and therapy. Diagnostic factors include patient characteristics and test findings. So like I mentioned, the pharmacotherapy factors included were based on the columns of that table from the ADA guidelines. And the therapies included were based on the rows of the table, which are the categories of anti-hyperglycemic treatments. Patient characteristics were based on what were included in the NET-CE studies. So things like symptoms, conditions, and diseases, as well as patient behavior, their occupation, as well and family and personal history. And test finding pretty much correspond to the different types of lab measurements that you might get from taking a urine sample or a blood sample or their weight measurement. So using this ontology, we created personal health knowledge graphs based on example patients from the NetCE. So we adapted those patients slightly, but we looked at 3 patients from the NetCE case study, which we then represented into RDF. We support 2 types of representations. So what you're seeing on the right, which I'll zoom in shortly, is based on the semantic integrated ontology representation, which is a much simpler representation than the other representation we support, which is FHIR, the Fast Healthcare Interoperability Resource. However, FHIR is a bit more familiar in the clinical space. So we support both these representations. So just a quick look. So on the right, we have a patient, Caitlin, who has attributes at their first visit corresponding to their symptoms and their history. She also has lab measurement values like their weight and age, as well as HbA1c, different cholesterol measurements, and triglyceride. And then we can use those measurements to do reasoning. So on the left here, we're seeing that her HbA1c is at a value of 183, which we can infer deductively to be in the diabetes range, which is done through a simple restriction on the value. Yes, Shruti?
I don't know if it's the A1C or if it's the glucose itself, because A1C is typically 5 to something.
So A1C is typically defined in percentages, but that percentage actually corresponds to a blood glucose measurement as well.
Okay.
So this 141 is about 6.5%. So pretty much by looking at her measurement, we can classify her HbA1c to be in the diabetes range or diabetes level. And that could trigger an abductive query on the right of what are some explanations for her diabetes to be in the HbA1c level. And then we might find some explanations related to insufficient exercise. Maybe her diet has too much sugar. Maybe she's not taking any medication for her HbA1c, or if she is, maybe it's not working. So the way we actually run this query is using an existing abductive reasoner, the AAA box solver. So it's pretty much packaged as a jar file where you can specify certain arguments, such as abducibles. So this concept of abducible will come up several times in this talk. So pretty much abducibles are resources in the ontology that you want to restrict the inclusion of in the explanations returned. So instead of searching the entire ontology space, we're just searching through a set of limited resources. So while this does reduce the time it takes to reason, since we're not reasoning over the entire ontology, this does somewhat presume some knowledge of what you expect in the explanations. So we evaluated DPO, both using the guiding principles for developing computational biomedical knowledge, as well as through running the abductive reasoner on its ability to answer competency questions and to answer those questions. So the CSA evaluation is available on our ontology website in the supplementary material section. And I'll discuss briefly the competency question-based evaluation. So some terminology, I mentioned abducibles are concepts you want to restrict in the query. Going back here, we see this set of abducibles that we included in a query, we could actually split these up into subsets and run 2 queries, or however many subsets there are. And that way, we're actually running the query over less abducibles. So that's what number of segments correspond to. Abducibles are the average number of abducibles per segment. The depth, so the algorithm used that AAA ABOC solver uses includes a breadth first search component. So the depth actually adds another constraint on that breadth first search to only go so deep in the search. And it actually also corresponds to the number of assertions that appears in explanations. So we timed out the execution of the ABOC reasoner to 120 seconds, 2 minutes. So typically when a doctor is meeting a patient, maybe the 15 minutes, 20 minutes to spend with that patient. So if we're spending a lot of time reasoning, then there's not enough time to interact with the patient. So we set a very low value of 2 minutes for our timeout. And we also created subsets of the ontology specific to the competency question we were evaluating, and these are called modules. So just something to note, HbA1c module is pretty small, whereas therapy module is pretty large. So I'm going to just show 2 of the evaluations related to these 2 modules, but all 6 are in the thesis and available as extra slides if we want to go through them later. So the first competency question related to what are some causes for HbA1c level in the diabetes range. So pretty much we ran it without specifying abducibles, with specifying all the abducibles and splitting up into 2 segments. And these are the results here. So for example, when we did a depth of 1, we didn't get all 9 explanations, but doing a depth of 2, we were able to. So for smaller ontologies, maybe you don't need to go too far in depth. But for when we split the ontology into 2 segments, we were actually able to run a depth of 3, which we weren't able to with 1 or 0 segments. So the therapy module is actually a lot bigger than the HbA1c level, as we saw. So without specifying any abducibles, it actually timed out even at a depth of 1. But when we do specify the abducibles, we can do a depth of 1, but we can't go down to a depth of 2. But by splitting into 3, we're able to do a depth of 2, but it actually still times out in a depth of 3. So actually this shows that having large ontologies is not necessarily conducive to abductive reasoning, right? So this ontology was larger than the HbA1c module, so this one wasn't even able to complete within the time frame for the depth of 3. Yes?
The therapy module has only 9 drugs, right? Or 9 classes of drugs, and you have multiple drugs within those subclasses, like sulfonylureas could have multiple drugs. Is that why it's large?
Yeah, we had, so sulfonylurea, GLP-1, those are the categories of drugs, but there's specific drugs within those. So pretty much from this evaluation, we see the importance of conciseness when performing abduction. We saw smaller modules resulted in faster computations, and by subsetting abducibles, we can go a greater depth into the computations. And that brings us to the second part of this talk, which relates to the system design. So as part of this work, we define ensemble reasoning as integration and interaction between multiple types of reasoning. So we designed, implemented, and integrated various reasoners to create an ensemble reasoning system. And in order to evaluate the therapy planning resulting from the system, we defined two metrics for comparing decision trees. So the design of the system goes back to the overarching research question of how can we create a system that supports clinical decision-making in a way similar to how clinicians do. So this could be useful in disseminating a large amount of knowledge or when new guidelines come out. And we did so in an approach that leverages the ST model, and we did so by creating reasoning agents for each of the types of reasoning included in the ST model. So each type of reasoning had its own agent, and then we used this to do differential diagnosis and therapy planning. So the architecture we used to build our agents was YIS, which supports nanopublications and already has an agent-based architecture. So we pretty much created agents using the existing framework. The deductive reasoning we did was using Square, which was developed by this lab, which is a form of deductive reasoning based on Sparkle construct queries. And the reason we use this instead of a traditional deductive reasoner is that it allows us to very easily write custom reasoning rules for like specific clinical axioms that we wanted to write. This is available as a Python package. And then finally, the abductive reasoner we integrated was the ABOC solver mentioned earlier. So we designed an algorithm to do truth maintenance, which can be used to automate the differential diagnosis process. So this algorithm iterates through potential explanations and it searches for direct evidence for those explanations. That evidence is used to reject or support hypotheses, which are initially unsupported. And then we kind of recursively go through and try to find explanations and try to support them. And there's also potential for optimization by using relevant modules instead of the whole ontology. Our therapy planning approach is based on query-based ranking. So we designed an agent to do therapy planning, which given a patient's characteristics, we can infer what factors are relevant to that patient. And based on those factors, we can link to therapies that are associated with that factor. So for example, a therapy might be associated with weight gain or weight loss, and an overweight patient may prefer a therapy that is associated with weight loss, right? So we use a simple weighting approach where if there's a negative association with that factor, we gave it a value of -1. And if there's a positive association, we gave it a value of +1. And then we ordered the therapy categories based on their final scores. Something to know real quick, what you're seeing on the right is an output on one of the patients, which is returned as a Python dictionary. And I mentioned this because we didn't want to present this form of output to the participants of the study. So we ended up cleaning up this output or formulating it as a table. So in order to evaluate our therapy planning recommendations, we compared it against the 2022 ADA guideline recommendations. And we also created 28 example patients. These aren't based on the NetCE. These patients, 7 of them just had one factor preference, such as cost preference or weight loss preference and so on. And then for every combination of 2 factor preferences, we created 21 more patients. So when I say we compared it against the ADA guidelines, there's a flowchart in chapter 9 of the guidelines, which given your factors, you can traverse the flowchart and see which therapy categories should be recommended. So we designed 2 metrics. So starting from 0 for metric one, we compare the difference between the rankings. So for example, if you look at ASCVD, Bagranite got 2, SGLT2 got 1, GLP P got 1, whereas over there, Bagranite got 2, 3, S got 2, and G got 2. So those 3 therapy categories are different. So M1 has a score of 3. The way you should read this is that the arrow means preferred over. So Bagranite is preferred over S, T, or G, which is preferred over D or U. So it's pretty much, it gives an order that you should recommend therapies. The second ranking, M2, relates to, well, can we move one of the nodes to, or what's the minimal number of movements we can do so that the graphs are comparable? So even though there were 3 differences based on M1, if we just move T over 1, then the graphs look the same. So M2, the metric was only 1. So pretty much we want low scores to correspond to similarity. So we did this for the single factors. And actually for hypoglycemia, our approach matched exactly with the ADA guidelines, which was interesting. Overall, for single factors, we did pretty well, where for M1, we had an average of less than 2, as well as for M2. So that means only at most 2 therapy differences between our recommendation versus the ADA guidelines, which is actually really good.
Sabbir, could you go back 1 slide for a second?
Sure.
Okay.
And the worst case for this was 3. We also did this for all of the dual factory. We did this for all of the dual factor patients as well. And from that, the dual factor evaluation, we didn't perform as well as a single factor evaluation, which is actually to be expected because, as I mentioned before, we used a very simple weighting approach where all of the factors were weighted equally. However, in the ADA guidelines, high risk factors like heart failure or kidney disease risk or cardiovascular disease risk are actually weighted higher than factors like cost or weight loss.
So within the guidelines, I don't really see them specifying that certain things have a higher weightage.
Sure.
Did you?
Well, so if you look here, if you have high risk factors over here,
Oh,
you go down this line and then you go down to the other side.
So,
Whereas if it's not, you start on the other side.
so it's only mentioned in the flow chart, not in the.
Yeah, and we're comparing against the flowchart. So which eventually corresponds to this factor preference, right? However, we used equal weighting. Nevertheless, average, we still, for the dual factor evaluation, got less than 3 for both metrics. So even though we're using a relatively simple ranking approach, the recommendations are comparable. So we implemented an ensemble reasoning system, which was, I guess, motivated by the type of reasoning the ST model has, where you have multiple types of reasoners interacting. We defined 2 metrics for comparing decision trees, and we evaluated against the ADA guidelines. So I mentioned that we designed a truth maintenance algorithm to automate differential diagnosis. We actually didn't implement that algorithm, we just designed it. So the differential diagnosis we're doing is by manually triggering the agents. However, when we implement this algorithm, we can actually automate the workflow. So right now the workflow is not fully automated. There's some manual input going on. So that's some future work that can be done. Also, as mentioned, the ranking approach was way too simple. Better weighting would result in better results. And additional considerations include further incorporation of provenance. Okay, so that brings us to part 3 of this talk, which relates to the survey that we designed. So This research contribution relates to the comprehensive approach and reusable methodology to designing a clinical survey to study clinical relevance. And as mentioned before, the output of the system was in this Python dictionary JSON form, but we found a way to represent the inputs and outputs in a way that non-technical participants could understand. And our survey design is reusable and could be applied in other domains or problems. So the survey consisted of both open response questions and Likert scale based questions. So Likert scale is things like strongly agree, agree, neutral, disagree, strongly disagree. So something we can assign a quantitative value to. And the motivation for conducting the study was to test the clinical relevance of our approach. And we did this by interviewing 10 practicing clinicians. So here are the open response questions. I won't read through all of them because we'll actually go through them individually. And here are the Likert scale questions. And as I mentioned, they could be strongly agree, agree, neutral, disagree, or strongly disagree. And we assigned numeric values to each of these. So when we were conducting the interviews, the first thing we did was we showed the participants' patient data, which included a text description of their different visits, of things like their symptoms and some of their lab measurements. Also, each patient, we had a problem list, vital signs, actual lab measurements, and any existing medications that they were on. So after showing the patients, we asked them if they had any immediate thoughts about the patients. And this question actually, we asked as they were reading through the patient descriptions. So part of it was them reiterating what they were reading, but we also noticed some interesting things like skepticism about whether the patient's actually following the exercise plan or taking their therapy. And also some of the clinicians would do a more aggressive treatment than what was being done in the examples. After going through each patient, we asked them if there's anything else they wanted to know. Things that came out were stuff like medical history, additional lab measurements, and financial information. So next we showed them the derived treatment factors. So since a patient was diagnosed with diabetes and had an A1C greater than 9%, we inferred that efficacy was a treatment factor. Since they were on a fixed income, we inferred that cost is a treatment factor. And since they were obese, we inferred that weight change is a treatment factor. So after showing this to the participants, we showed them the first Likert question that the factors the system identified are clinically relevant. Then we asked if there's any facts the system missed that they would have deemed relevant. So there were some conditions that they mentioned. Here's a quote from one of the participants. I think that the factors that need to be considered are not equal. I don't think that cost is as important as weight gain, nor is it as important as the ability to reduce cardiovascular risk. This actually goes back to that whole idea of the simple
Exactly
weighting
the
approach,
problem with our
that like a more complex weighting approach may need to be taken. And that might actually be dependent on the clinician's preferences or the specific patient. Then we showed the recommendations provided by the system. And we showed the treatment factors that corresponded to those recommendations. So these were the recommendations and the treatment factors. This is kind of the simple weighting that you're seeing, where positive factors resulted in a score of +1, neutral factors didn't add to the score, and negative factors resulted in a score of -1. So we didn't show them the values. This is what we showed them, but this is actually what contributed to the rankings. So once showing these, we asked the Likert question, the system's recommendations are clinically appropriate for this patient. And the open-ended response question, if there were other things the system should have considered, which included different treatments and other approaches for weight loss, such as bariatric surgery. What's actually kind of interesting here was the opinion on metformin. Some of the doctors really liked metformin, others didn't. And then we also showed them the Likert question. Overall, the system recommendations about patients were clinically relevant, and the ability to see system rationale is important. So next, we asked questions about so those two Likert questions were about the overall system, and we also asked open response questions about the overall system. So one of the participants said, I think it's essential because if you don't have the ability to watch the rationale through or see the process through for the making, you can make erroneous decisions much more easily if you don't see why the thought was made, and it helps you clarify your choice by understanding the rationale for it. We also asked them about improvements and additional capabilities, which they mentioned additional patient data, more general factors, therapy preferences, and more aggressive treatment. We asked about the general view of AI systems and their impact on medicine. So the vast majority were supportive of AI in medicine. There was one notable exception who thinks AI is very frightening and needs to be regulated. So that participant mentioned things about ethics regulation and replacing existing workers with AI that they were really afraid of. This quote is actually a lot longer, which is included in the thesis, but there were some very interesting talks, to say the least. Other things about the general impact of AI related to being used as a tool or for training. So one of the participants said, I think for someone who doesn't have a differential or doesn't have experience, who's actually spending more time asking questions of why and why and why, then this would be a phenomenal learning tool to gather that type of thought process of what should I be thinking of? What care should I be doing? What should I do? That would give them the resources to see where their knowledge deficit may be. They also mentioned it might be useful when new guidelines come out, or they'd like to see it for streamlining mundane tasks like note-taking or certain record keeping. Finally, we asked them about overall suggestions and recommendations for improvement. One of the participants, when talking about insurance, said, it's fine if the medicine can raise people from the dead, it's fine. But if you can't get prior authorization through, it doesn't matter that you can raise them from the dead, that is a good medicine. Someone else also said, I think it should probably include things like, has the patient had their eye exam yet? Kind of the boring, unsexy things we forget about all the time. There's also some talk about fail-safes and warnings to be included. So as mentioned before, we assigned the Likert scores a score of 2 if they strongly agreed, a score of -2 if they strongly disagreed. So for example, for participant 3, they agreed for LQ1 that the factors were relevant, but they strongly disagreed with the recommendations. I think this had to do with them not liking metformin, for example, and so on. So pretty much a score close to 2 means the average was a strong agreement. A score close to 0 means neutral. A score close to -2 means strong disagreement. So even though there were some disagreements, what's really nice to see here is that all of the averages were greater than 0. So there was more agreement than disagreement. Also, for some of the scores, like LQ1, for example, we have scores greater than 1. So for individual factors, there was agreement and some strong agreement that the factors were clinically relevant. This wasn't necessarily true for the recommendations, where we're seeing some 0.2 averages where there were some mixed reviews. But what's interesting here is that even though some of the participants didn't agree with the recommendations, If you look at the overall, we have scores greater than 1 for overall the system recommendations were clinically relevant and the ability to see rationale is important. So even though, for example, participant 5 strongly disagreed about the recommendations for patient K, overall they strongly agreed that the recommendations were clinically relevant. So very positive results here. The results supported our claims that our recommendations and rationales are clinically relevant. It led to a lot of interesting discussions. It also highlighted some limitations of our system. So the physicians had this situation awareness where through their experience, they know they can look at a patient information and pick out certain things that wasn't encoded in the system. For example, if a patient is young, then more aggressive therapy could be used, or they might be on Medicaid as opposed to, or they might be on private insurance as opposed to if they're greater than 65, then they're more likely on Medicaid and won't be able to afford certain treatment options. Also, there were certain factors and therapies that certain participants preferred over others. So there was this idea of factor preferences. Also, again, the idea of an improved weighting could improve the results was brought up. And this brings us to our final part of the talk, which is relatively pretty short just because I didn't want to go too deep into the theory here. But pretty much we did some theoretical analysis to support our design decisions or to direct which design decisions we wanted to take. So this fourth research contribution relates to guidelines for design considerations when designing an ensemble reasoning system. And we use logical proofs to analyze temporal impact of reasoning order approach of subsetting abducibles and also determining interrelated abducibles. So pretty much we did an inductive proof where we first considered 2 reasoners, 3 reasoners, and 4 reasoners before extending to n as many reasoners as you want when impacting reasoning order. So reasoning order means like if I do abduction first, then deduction, then induction, is that the same as doing deduction first, then induction, then abduction? Does that reasoning order matter? What we found that for any H reasoners, if M is the number of iterations required for the optimal sequence to complete, it'll take at most n plus H minus 1 iterations to complete. So pretty much what that means is as long as you have your max iteration set to greater than m plus h minus 1, then despite the reasoning order, both approaches will terminate. So the order of reasoning doesn't necessarily make a significant impact. We also looked at reasoning approaches. So there were 2 approaches we considered. An iterative approach like the ST model where you cycle through the different types of reasoning and you go through them one at a time, versus an alternating approach like agent-based reasoning where the results of one type of reasoning might trigger the execution of a different type of reasoner. We used an inductive approach to analyze this as well. And pretty much the insight was since all of the reasoners will run with all of the inputs eventually, these 2 approaches are comparable. The main difference here is that with the iterative approach, you can set a max number of iterations, whereas an agent-based approach, it might be better for more on-the-fly reasoning. Yes.
Just a quick clarification here. So I'm assuming these reasoners are essentially adding their conclusions to the knowledge base. So then new reasoners can work with it. You're not, for example, considering backward chaining or something like that. Is that right? Or
right. So pretty much the reasoner. So for example, yeah. So what you're saying is true. Where you reason and infer new knowledge, that knowledge is added back to the knowledge graph, right? So agent-based reasoners are actually triggered by new knowledge being added to the graph. So did the graph change states? If so, then is there anything new I can infer? Whereas for iterative reasoning, you add new knowledge to the graph and then the next reasoner runs. So if the first reasoner that added stuff to the graph hadn't run, then the knowledge associated with that knowledge wouldn't be added by the second reasoner. But once it iterates all the way through, it would have run. So then that second reasoner is eventually going to infer the things that it would have inferred if the first reasoner had been before it rather than after. So that was kind of the basis for the proof. So as long as you have enough iterations, the two approaches are comparable. So our A-box, our abductive reasoning was based on this A-box abduction solver, which is an existing implementation based on Writer's minimum hitting set algorithm. I mentioned before that there's a breadth first search in here, and that's what that depth limitation was about. So it actually turns out this algorithm is NP complete, meaning it's non-polynomial. So you'll get you'll get answers eventually, but it might be by the time we're all dead, for example. So why would we use a NP complete reasoner? Well, it actually turns out by adding the appropriate constraints, we can still get the results we want. And that actually, again, shows the importance of specifying abducibles or limiting your depth or even subsetting to constrain this reasoner as much as possible. So we wanted to evaluate the impact of subsetting abducibles. Is it quicker to subset abducibles or just to run over the full set of abducibles? Well, as you can imagine, since it's MP complete, especially when you're doing parallel processing, where one subset, the maximum time for one subset to complete is equal to the maximum time, that's quite obviously will reduce the total computation time when you're running on a smaller subset. However, we also found that even in serial executions where you don't have to do parallel processing, the combination of the time it takes to do the subsets is actually less than the time it takes to run on all of the abducibles. However, the problem with subsetting is that you might have missing explanations. So if you have an explanation that depends on two interrelated abducibles, and if those abducibles are in different subsets, then that explanation won't show up as part of your results. So that's kind of the main limitation to subsetting abducibles. We do a brute force analysis of how we can find all of those, but it's probably not the most efficient way to find all the interrelated abducibles. So kind of the idea here is, well, when you're specifying abducibles, you have some knowledge of what you're expecting to be included in the explanations. So you could also use that knowledge to kind of determine which abducibles might be interrelated. So it's not necessarily an automated approach for determining what to do, but it's using kind of your knowledge of the problem to include the related abducibles within the same subsets. And that brings us to the conclusion of this talk. So we had 4 main research contributions. So that was our approach for semantic knowledge representation that supports multimodal reasoning, our semantic workflow for creating an ensemble reasoning system that supports clinical decision-making, our comprehensive approach and reusable method for designing a clinical relevance evaluation survey, and our guidelines through theoretical analysis for design considerations and decisions. So there's some future work that we discussed a lot of this already based on some of the insights we got from the participants as well as from our evaluation results. So the ontology could code more information. Abducibles need to be explicitly specified. So maybe there could be a way to automatically find the abducibles that are relevant and the interrelated ones. The workflow is not fully automated, so that could be implemented. The ranking approach could be improved, and we could also design more intricate patient representations. Also, there's the idea we could incorporate user interaction. So the clinicians had their own preferences for certain factors and for certain therapies. So what if the system could learn from the users? That would be really, really interesting, and have like interactive weighting. So what if we didn't have to assign the weights? What if the users assigned what their weights were? So there's definitely a level of user interaction that could be incorporated. However, this approach, everything we've talked about here, we apply to a clinical reasoning setting, but it could be applied very easily to another setting. So it's very generalizable. Our survey is generalizable. The architecture we used is not domain specific. And while the ontology was domain specific, we could use our ontology design approach to create a concise ontology in other domains. As mentioned, users have pre-existing preferences, which could be leveraged. And what was also really interesting was that even though some of the doctors disagreed with the recommendations, they all agreed that the inclusion of rationale was very important to build trust within the system, and that a transparent system encourages trust, interpretability, traceability, and explanations. And that concludes this talk. I'd like to acknowledge my wife, Samia, who's also doing a PhD. So it's very likely without her, I would be spending more time playing video games. She's very hardworking, so like it forced me to be hardworking. Obviously, I want to thank my family. First and foremost, I want to be here for my parents who emigrated here and like really taught me math at a very early age and supported my education. I have a twin brother, Swab, who I've always, we actually learned how to program together. We were both doing electrical engineering, which wasn't very intensive on programming, but we'd go to the library and read like books on C++ and like practice creating visual programs and stuff. So we've learned a lot together, and also my older sister Sabrina has been very supportive. I wouldn't be here if not for my advisor Deborah, and I'm also grateful for the remaining committee members, Jim, Amr, and Mohammed Zaki. Yeah, I'm just really happy you introduced me to the semantic web. It clicked right away, and I enjoyed it a lot more than doing electrical engineering research, for example. Of course, everyone here at Tetherless World has been really great. We had a lot of interesting discussions. I'm glad that people are starting to come back into the lab. Even before that, before people left the lab, and now we're doing like a lot of game nights and stuff. So that's been great. And also my friends outside of RPI have been supportive as well. And I guess I'll open it up to questions now.
So we're going to take general questions first, and then after those, then we'll kick everybody out who's not on the committee. So general first.
I got a question. So you had mentioned earlier that for abductive reasoning, there's some limitations due to ontology sizes, I believe. Are there other rules or guidelines that you've discovered along the way, especially when you're setting up your problem, on when to prefer or use one form of reasoning over another?
Right, so pretty much the preference for deductive reasoning is if you know that what you're trying to deduce will be inherent in the data, then, so for example, like categorizing a patient based on their measurements, it's very natural to do that using deductive reasoning, where you just write rules related to ranges on measurements and whatnot. Whereas if you have more like a question that you want to ask the reasoner, that's where abductive reasoning came into play. So why is the HbA1c level in the range that it is? What are different treatments that could be considered? So like more questions to the reasoner rather than inferred information. It's more naturally abductive in the way that humans reason. So also in the way the system reasoning, that could be more done with abductive reasoning, whereas implicit information to make it explicit deductive reasoning.
Thank you.
So I was just thinking that the reasoning approach that you have developed possibly can become a kind of explainer method, because oftentimes these days neurosymbolic approaches are things that the community prefers. I also see that, like, for example, let's say that a chatbot says a sulfonylurea is something which should be used for this patient. Your approach could then say why it should be used, using basically the patient's knowledge graph as a kind of way to support a prediction from something like a black box model.
Right.
About how you could try and integrate your approach into maybe a simple black box example, like.
Well, so the integration between large language models and explainable AI is like ongoing research right now, right? So I guess one way to do it is if you ask a chatbot or something a question and you get the results. If you were to use like NLP to formulate the results into some kind of
Entities,
some kind of assertion, then you could maybe query about that assertion and then try to find explanations for it. But however, you would need that knowledge base to exist prior to that. Yes, Neha?
Okay, I have a couple of questions, some conceptual and some just clarification question on each of your parts, but I can shorten it if required. The first one is, like you said, you use competency questions. Can you share how did you come up with those questions, please?
So let's go back.
It was in your slide 20-ish, I guess.
So pretty much, we wanted to apply this clinical decision support system to differential diagnosis and to therapy planning, right? So these first three questions relate to differential diagnosis in a way. For example, what are some causes of the HbA1c level being in the diabetes range, actually going back here. So we have these four causes, and actually differential diagnosis could be like, okay, insufficient exercise is one of those causes. Oh, wait, we have some Fitbit data showing that they are actually exercising. So maybe cross that out. And maybe we have some food data related to their diet. So maybe we can cross that out. And we see that they are taking the therapy. They have some proof that they are taking it or they're already prescribed a therapy. So that might lead to the result that the therapy is not working, right? So that in turn might trigger the therapy planning module, like, okay, so therapy is not working. What's another therapy we can add, or what would be a better therapy? So the second half of the competency questions relate to therapy planning. So you might ask which therapies have high efficacy, which have potential for weight loss, which have potential risk benefits.
So mainly like based on what your knowledge graph is giving, you are just coming up yourself, or you're using literature and talking to some experts and getting your questions from there?
No, we came up with these competency questions ourselves just to test the capabilities.
Got it. Thank you. You mentioned a lot of time that there were your algorithm would time out and you had like 2 minutes something, if I got that correctly. So you're stating that timing out is a good thing, or are you stating that, if your ontologies have depth X, then they are good because you can reason over those ontologies quickly and help the clinicians, or something else?
So in a practical application, timing out isn't a good thing because then you don't get all the explanations. However, that does support our claim that for this type of reasoning, having smaller ontologies are better equipped to not time out. So while you don't necessarily want things to time out, what we were evaluating was the impact of conciseness. So actually, the fact that the larger ontology timed out does support our claim, and it does also show that, okay, maybe you want to subset the abducibles more or create a more concise module.
Okay. I can let others go before I go to the part 2. I don't want to take up the entire time.
So I've just got a question about, you mentioned that you use a truth maintenance system, right? And I was trying to understand exactly what role that plays here, right? My experience, the truth maintenance system is used so that when you remove a current conclusion from the knowledge base, it knows what else to retract that was inferred based upon that particular piece of knowledge, right? Where is knowledge getting removed here? Is that happening at all, or?
Well, so that kind of goes back to this abductive explanation where, so for example, potential explanations for HbA1c level is insufficient exercise. However, if we see in the data that there is sufficient, if they are exercising, there's like that contradiction there, then we can remove this as a potential explanation. So pretty much by remove, we're just tagging that explanation as unsupported or rejected. So pretty much is to provide support for potential explanations. So then we can narrow down the set of explanations to try to come up with what's the most likely cause.
Right. So essentially one reasoner is saying, here's some explanations, and maybe another reasoner says, well, no, not that one.
Exactly.
And that's where then this comes in, because if you had that one and then some other reasoner said, well, if that's true, then this is true and this is true. And that's what you need to remove.
Right.
Got it.
Sabbir, you mentioned, great talk, first of all, thank you. You mentioned you're using some measurements such as vital signs or results of tests. Have you given thought to making sure that you have valid quantities there? Would that be a separate layer of reasoning itself, for example?
Right. So the measurements we included was based on these diabetes case studies. And we pretty much used the values from those case studies, and then we added some for what didn't happen. And actually, there were some comments about those. Like, for example, even though a patient was on metformin, her weight was continuing to rise, which you'd maybe see it reduce a little bit. Maybe the blood sugar would go down, which actually led the doctor to think like, oh, is she really even taking her metformin?
Yeah.
So yeah, there could be some validation done for like this kind of patient example design, which could even be done through reasoning, right? But yeah. Sasha, you had a question?
Yeah. Slide number 4. What is ranking? Is it solution ranking? On the top of the slide. And each of the feedback loops.
Yeah, so I actually have an example.
By the way, thanks for the great talk, actually. That was really cool.
Okay, so I don't know if you guys can see this, but this is an example of the ST model being used in a case where a patient has unexpected weight gain. So what are some causes? So first of all, she gained 20 pounds in 2 months. That was unexpected. Is it clinically relevant or not? If it is clinically relevant, what are some clinically relevant reasons that she may have gained weight? And some may be more prevalent than others. And so this, you could potentially rank the potential explanations based on certain things. And as you see here, we're like crossing out explanations based on maybe the patient data until finally coming up with the most likely cause being metabolism decrease. So that's just an idea of how the ST model could be used for like a differential diagnosis scenario.
Yeah, it sounds very familiar in terms of cognitive behavioral therapy. There's always evaluation happening as part of the feedback loop.
Right, yeah, and apparently when doctors reason over patients, they're constantly going back and forth between the different types of reasoner. Like maybe they're ordering more labs to test a specific thing, which they can then cross out. Or maybe the lab does show that the thyroid isn't active, and that allows you to diagnose her with hypothyroidism.
Right.
Neha, real quick.
Okay, part 2 of your presentation. You talked about multiple approaches that you took for doing your reasoning and other stuff. But like, for example, you said dual factor approach did not work because that is what you expected. But apart from that, you had other approaches that you took. Was it a reason to take multiple approaches? Like, why did you decide to take these approaches? Just compare or come up with the best one?
Well, so we had single factor and dual factor. So the difference between that is single factor meant that there's only one thing that we really care about. There's only one preference. So for example, the patient only wants, the only thing that matters for the patient is a therapy that will cause weight loss, or a therapy that's cheap, or a therapy that has reduced heart failure or cardiovascular risk because maybe they have a family history of cardiovascular disease, right? There's only one factor that's contributing to the choice of the recommendation. However, more realistically, there's multiple things to consider, right? So maybe they are low income, so they want a cost efficient, but they're also overweight, so they want something that has weight loss association, but they have cardiovascular history, so you also want CVD. So that's what dual factor is. We consider all of the pairings of two factors. You could also do like trifactor or quad factor, but then there were just so many combinations, it just didn't necessarily make sense to go through all of those combinations.
Got it, thank you. So where did you get these patients' data from?
Well, for the factor evaluation, we literally just created hypothetical patients where the only patient data was that they had a preference for a certain factor. So when we created 28 patients, 7 of those were associated with one factor preference, and the remaining 21 had 2 factor preferences. So then we just were able to run the system based on the 2.
Thank you. Just follow up on this. So in part 3, you said like you had 10 clinicians for your study. I'm assuming you did go through the IRB process for sure.
Mm-hmm.
So how did you select these 10?
Great question. So, right, we went through we went through an IRB study to get the recruitment of participants. So because they were human, even though we're not actually doing human subject research necessarily, but because we're interviewing humans, we had to go through the IRB process. So we ended up getting 10 participants, and the main inclusion criteria was that they had experience treating diabetes. We also wanted participants that were currently in practice and that were at least aware of the ADA guideline. Maybe they don't follow it directly, but they would at least be familiar with the kind of recommendations included in the guidelines. So then we went through a screening process we actually hired Schlesinger, which is now Sago, to recruit these patients for us and screen them to meet the eligibility criteria.
Interesting, just last question. Sorry, like your work is very interesting, so that is why it's generating so much good questions in my mind. So at the end, you said like the future work and how this is happening. So did you had a big goal where all this work is actually contributing to or making a pathway or something?
I guess it's making a pathway for some journal publications.
Okay.
I mean, so there's definitely business opportunities here, which was made apparent from the clinical interviews where they really want something like this to reduce mundane tasks or to have a second set of eyes to maybe so they don't have to stay up to date with the guidelines themselves and to have recommendations. And it was actually the inclusion of rationale for the recommendations, which they really liked, because what they've seen of AI have been mostly black box models. So like having something where you have some justification for the choices, even if they didn't agree with the choices, it might be nice, especially for like new clinicians or mid-level physicians who may be transferred from a different domain. So I probably won't pursue this as a business, and probably to actually get this into electronic health systems is maybe 10 iterations down the line. But this is a start in that direction to hopefully aiding clinicians rather than replacing them.
Awesome, thanks.
Last two questions.
One last question. Yeah. So kind of building on Jeff's question as well as also Ahmed's question, I think that trying to surface some of the explanations, which like basically the system considered to be invalid, might be useful in situations when the users disagree with the system. Like, for example, the clinicians might be like, the weight seems to be going up. They seem to be taking metformin. They say they're taking metformin. Was there a suggestion that the system knew about which sort of would be valid under this combination of metformin and weight gain? So was there like a suggestion that the system might know that, so under those circumstances you could surface?
Yeah, so some of the participants said that like this kind of system would be helpful for new physicians, but it wouldn't be helpful for me because I know all this already,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, we have to see.
However, they did find the inclusions of rationale interesting for things that they did disagree with. And they said that, okay, definitely when there's recommendations that I disagree with, it's nice to know what were the factors that went into those recommendations. For them to be like, okay, well, if I could tell the system to also include these factors or to give more weight to this factor, or I know metformin actually has kidney risk, even though the 22 guidelines say that it's kidney neutral. So using the physician's own knowledge, it allows them to see what rationales was included by the system, which they think the system missed, which then it goes back to that interactive component. Well, then maybe they could add that knowledge to the system and get more custom recommendations. There's also like legal issues, legal considerations where if they made a recommendation, then at least they can go back to the explanation and be like, oh, this is why I made the recommendation, rather than a black box explanation of like, oh, the system told me to do it and I just followed the system. So that like traceability. Do you have a question, Sabbir?
Yes.
Yeah.
Asked.
Actually, no, a couple, no, only one, yeah. So slide number 15, patient data. So it's my understanding there was no assessment of social factors, which seems to play a role in many of the clinical issues, and sometimes they're overlooked. So I was wondering why these were not included. Was it because there was no social data available from the patients? I think it was a slide prior, but anyways. No social data available, or whether because it's so difficult to assess, or was it not deemed important, or why was it not deemed important if that's the case?
Right, so this kind of goes back to this whole conciseness thing, where we only wanted to include things in the personal health knowledge graphs and ontology that were scoped out. Right, and what we included in terms of patient characteristics and systems were based on the NetCE case studies. So we only included the things that were included in those case study patient descriptors. So this was also mentioned by the participants. Like, for example, if someone's working, right, and they have a gym at work, maybe they're more likely to exercise.
Yeah.
Or if they have 2 kids, then they might recommend an exercise stroller so they can spend some time with the kids while exercising. Or other social considerations related to, do they have, if it's a really old patient, do they have a caretaker? Are they in a retirement home? Because if they're in a retirement home, maybe there's a cafeteria and they can't really choose their diet, it's given to them. Or is there someone who can inject insulin for them? Or do we have to give them oral therapy? So there's definitely a lot of social factors that came into play. And there's definitely a lot of things that we could include in a future iteration. The main reason we didn't include it was for scoping considerations.
Thanks.
Okay, if more people have questions, so the questions have been great and great talk. But if more people have comments or questions, please send them to Sabbir and me. And at this point, I'd like to ask everybody who's not on the committee to leave, but watch for an email because there will be brownies and some fruit upstairs later.
And I assume that includes me leaving since I.
Yeah, sorry, you know. Yeah.
Good job, Sabbir.
Yeah, sorry if I wasn't monitoring because I don't know what happened with this. I don't know whether they had questions in the chat.
No, I think we were good. We were enjoying the ones
Oh, okay, good.
on the scene.
So at this point, you should turn off the recording. Or actually.